The winter was of that peculiarly English severity which looks less to the thermometer than to the marrow. On a certain Thursday evening, the fog had crept up from the river and seated itself at our window, a sallow and patient visitor that tapped with cold fingers against the pane of Baker Street. Dr. Watson, whose habits of punctuality were never proof against a sleet storm, sat nearer the fire than he would own, while Mr. Sherlock Holmes, cross-legged upon the settee, was producing a low, continuous thrum from his violin, a sound as thin and penetrating as the night's own breath. "If you will move your chair 2 inches to the left, Watson," said he, without so much as a glance, "you will spare yourself the draught which, proceeding beneath the sill and rising along the curtain, is directed with malice at your right ear." I obeyed, smiling, and discovered the truth of his observation at once. "You are in a benevolent humour this evening." "I am merely conserving my biographer. An enfeebled narrator distorts the line of a case." He drew the bow across the strings in a single, shimmering note, and set the violin aside. "Besides, there will be need of your sturdy common sense before midnight. Indeed, you speak as if a case were already upon us." "Not upon us," he returned, but turning the corner. He pointed to the hearth-rug, upon which the faintest impression of granulated white had begun to melt, 6 oval specks laid with an exactness that no careless boot would achieve. "Sodium chloride," Holmes continued, "shaken from a leather pouch and spilt in haste. Our visitor is a churchman, or one who has had charge of a church floor this evening. The crystals are mixed with powdered pumice such as sacristans use to scour a step. He carries an umbrella repaired with harp wire and— here is the post." Mrs. Hudson entered with a salver, upon which lay a telegram and a thin envelope of blue vellum. Holmes took the first and tossed me the second. The telegram crackled like ice in his fingers. "Lestrade," he said. "There is always the economy of words and the prodigality of exclamation in Lestrade." He handed it to me. The message ran, "Urgent matter at Northumberland. Heathstop funeral. This afternoon. Held in total silence by threat. Stop undertaker found dead in churchyard at dusk. Stop no marks of violence. Snow around body undisturbed. Stop foul play. Suspected. Stop require assistance immediately. Stop Lestrade." "Silence?" I exclaimed. "A funeral in silence?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "A silence demanded is a silence purchased, and like everything bought under duress, it is counterfeit. The second item, Watson." I opened the blue envelope. Within was a rectangle of stiff paper, bearing a neat, clerkly hand in black ink. "If a word is spoken, there will be another death before nightfall. Leave the bells muffled, and keep your tongues likewise. The mourner who hears." There was neither address nor signature beyond that curious sobriquet. The paper had a watermark, a small crown, above the letters H and P. Holmes held it toward the lamp and nodded as if recognizing an old acquaintance. "Havisham and Pike, Holborn," said he. "Stationers to the discreet. Our correspondent buys good paper to send bad messages." He stood in one fluid motion. "Hat, Watson, by the time we reach Northumberland Heath, the fog will have changed its mind and become a snowfall. Lestrade's undisturbed snow is a tyrant we must confront before it smooths its own tracks." It was as he predicted. The journey was a long whistle through muffled white, the suburbs vanishing into quiet hedgerows and then into that bleak margin of Kentish heath which takes the last of London's smoke like an old shawl and wears it into night. The church of St. Saviour's, an ungainly, earnest Gothic of the last generation, stood lonely upon a rise, a scatter of headstones at its skirts, and the yews crouched like black dogs in attendance. The gate lamp burned a dull orange in the flurry. Lestrade awaited us within the porch, stamping like a man who has been both patient and cold. "You received it then, Mr. Holmes? Extraordinary business. I've kept the place as I found it." "As you should, though I doubt the place has been obliging enough to keep itself," Holmes replied. "Tell me first of the silent funeral." Lestrade pulled his scarf more tightly about his throat. "Today at 3 o'clock, the interment of Mr. Alistair Penrith, retired importer, known for 70 sermons worth of philanthropy. A widow, Mrs. Penrith, a nephew, Mr. Felix Arden, and a partner in trade, Mr. Gregory Vale. An hour before the funeral, the vicar, Reverend Clay, receives that same blue card, hand-delivered by a boy who vanished. He reads it to me later, shaking like a reed. We confer. He insists upon going forward, says to cancel would be to invite panic. The bell had already been muffled for the occasion, but he orders no hymn, no lesson, not a word beyond a prayer said inwardly. The mourners sit like statues, most unnatural. "On the contrary," said Holmes, stepping into the nave and drawing in the air through his nostrils with a faint, testing motion, "nothing is more natural than obedience to terror. You say there was a second threat? Not in writing, but at dusk, just as the last of the light was going, the undertaker, Thomas Keene, steps out to check the grave settling. 10 minutes pass. They find him not 50 paces from the porch, lying straight as a board upon the snow, his hands folded as if he'd arranged them that way himself, dead as a doornail." Dr. Hartley of the village looked him over. No bruises, no wounds, nothing. "And the snow, you'll see. No tracks, but his own out and his own back, none." "None?" Holmes's voice sharpened. "Or none that you recognized?" "Come and see," Lestrade muttered. We crossed the nave, my boots whispering upon the flags, and made for the north door which gave upon the churchyard. The air outside bit at one's teeth. Under the yew the snow lay with that deceitful smoothness which is the confederate of the careless policeman, and I confess that at first glance I saw only a pale sheet lit by the gate lamp's circle and broken by a single set of prints, firm, even steps from the porch towards a spot a little beyond the nearest headstone, and then here lay the body. Holmes crouched so suddenly that I started. He lowered his lantern close to the cold face. "Rime upon the lashes, but not upon the moustache," he murmured. "A man who came into the cold very recently from a warm place. The condensation had not formed before he fell. Observe, Watson, the hands. Folded, yes, but the thumbs are tucked beneath the fingers, not opposed the dead choose of their own accord." He touched the lapel with a gloved forefinger. "What do you make of this faint, sweet odour?" I bent. It was scarcely perceptible, clean, medicinal, with a steely edge. Hartshorn? Ammonia, at least, and an old companion, camphor. Holmes's eyes travelled to the man's boots. Cork-studded soles, undertakers favour them for quiet treading, yet note how sharply his steps are marked, as if the corks had been newly pared. The snow about him, Lestrade, hold the lantern lower. The inspector obeyed. In the yellow light I perceived that the powdery surface immediately surrounding the dead man was, in a circle of 3 feet, lustreless, as if sifted. Holmes drew from his pocket a narrow glass and a paper envelope, scooped a pinch, and regarded it beneath the lens. "Salt and pumice," said he with satisfaction, "enough to abrade and to melt without water. Who lays down such a bed? Not nature. You told me there were no other tracks." "None that I could swear to," Lestrade said doggedly. "We were careful. The gate was latched. There's no sign of a struggle." "No sign," Holmes repeated softly, as if the phrase pleased him. He stood and turned in a slow circle, lifting the lantern to the yew, to the roof, to the bell-cot. Snow feathered down in silent diligence. "Watson, what do you recall of Mr. Penrith?" I started at the question. "I know nothing of him." "Then we must know what those who did not speak today refused to say." He stepped to the headstone nearest the body and brushed the snow from its narrow top. "Felix Arden," he read from a newer stone beyond it. "A nephew who stands to inherit. We will discover how much. Lestrade, the boy who brought the card, find him. Reverend Clay, speak to him, but gently. Timid men remember more in a warm room. I shall wish to see Mr. Penrith's house, without alarming his household, and to examine the vestry now." "The vestry?" I asked. Holmes's answer was to lead us back within. He passed up the nave without comment upon the rigid pews and the starched silence they retained, and came to that side room where the parish keeps its books and its secrets. He bent over the table. "Ink of 2 shades," he said, indicating the register. "Entries made in a nervous hand after the service. And here, what is this?" He lifted a fragment of violet thread caught on the rough lip of a wooden chest. "Merely a shred," said Lestrade. "Violet is seldom merely anything," Holmes replied. He opened the chest and regarded its contents: bell muffles like black mittens, a coil of bell rope with its fibres frayed and tarred, a small bottle with a glass stopper, and a folded canvas. He unstopped the bottle and held it to his nose with caution. "Chloroform," he observed, and replaced it. "Not fresh, but present. We have thus a threat and a tool for making good the threat. To ensure a congregation holds its tongue, one need only deprive the organist of his, and the vicar of consciousness." Yet both stood and said nothing, which is stranger. Someone trusted that silence would be bought at a cheaper rate. He drew the canvas open. Within lay a low, wheeled bier, the sort used to move heavy coffins from hearse to nave. Holmes ran a finger along its rim and brought it up dusted with the same abrasive grit. "Salt and pumice again," said he, "to draw a weight over snow with minimal trace. A bier leaves no footsteps because it has none. We are dealing with a mind that thinks in surfaces." He turned to me, and there was that quick gleam which I had learned to recognize, the spark that meant the case had passed from puzzle to pursuit. "Come, Watson, we will pay our respects to the late Mr. Penrith at his house, and if propriety objects to visitors at this hour, we shall come as the sort of visitors propriety can never refuse. Lestrade, remain and keep your flock indoors. After the morning's enforced muteness, tongues will wag to excess unless you bridle them." "And what am I to tell them?" the inspector demanded. "Tell them," said Holmes, already at the door, "that silence is no longer in fashion, but that, tonight at least, it may save a life. You have a second death promised if words were spoken. Let us hope the promise was written by a liar. If not—" He paused, and for a heartbeat, the wind at the crack of the door took up his sentence in a chilly whisper. "If not, we must arrive before the undertaker has company." The carriage rattled over the frozen ruts of the Kentish road, and the wind seemed determined to follow us, sluicing past the open window and pricking at the ears. Holmes sat with the calm posture of a man accustomed to mapping the world in his mind rather than in front of him, eyes narrowed and observing the drift of smoke from distant chimneys, the pattern of tracks that crisscrossed the snow-laden heath, and the occasional flicker of a lantern in a far-off cottage. I, beside him, held my gloves tightly and attempted to reconcile the chill with the anxiety that had set itself upon my stomach. The case, odd, oppressive, and yet tantalizing, pressed upon me like the fog itself, seeping into every thought. "Do you notice, Watson," said Holmes, finally breaking his silence, "that no wheel marks approach the churchyard gate from the east?" I glanced where he indicated. The drift of snow did indeed show only footprints from the gate to the nave, and none from any cart or carriage. "I do," I admitted. "But is that remarkable? The undertaker may have come on foot." Holmes allowed a faint smile, though it did not reach the intensity of his gaze. "Ah, but the path leading away from the north side of the yard toward the village remains untouched. Yet Lestrade claims the boy delivered the blue card on foot and then vanished. A courier, or the instrument of our mystery. My attention is drawn to absence, Watson, not presence." I could not deny the logic. Holmes always found the weight of nothing, the spaces between events, more telling than any crowded detail. As the carriage swung around a bend in the road, we saw the house of the late Mr. Penrith crouching under its eaves, the windows dark, save for a flicker in the library. Holmes tapped the side of the carriage lightly. "Observe, Watson, the absence of warmth. Even at this hour the servants remain within, yet the faint light in that room suggests a solitary occupant, perhaps the widow or one of the executors. Their vigilance is curious. There is fear or else expectation. We shall see which prevails." We alighted without ceremony. Holmes's boots, though firm upon the frozen path, did not leave a single trace on the frost, or so it seemed. The front door yielded under his hand, not locked, but with a latch whose mechanism bore signs of recent manipulation. Inside, the air was warmer, yet tinged with the faint metallic scent that always accompanies anxiety and anticipation. Holmes paused in the hall, lifting his lantern to inspect the surfaces. Dust was minimal, however, the faintest smear of mud on the threshold, pointing toward the rear garden, caught his attention. "Someone entered in haste, yet did so with consideration. The mud is new, the snow outside is old." A servant appeared, a pale young woman with hands clasped and eyes lowered. "Mr. Holmes?" she murmured, her voice scarcely rising above the hush of the house. "The lady of the house awaits you." "Lead on," Holmes said, and I followed, noting the meticulous arrangement of furniture, the absence of personal disarray, the careful positioning of candlesticks. In the library, Mrs. Penrith rose, slender and elegant despite the dark circles beneath her eyes. Her grief was palpable, yet she carried herself with a composure that suggested more calculation than despair. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, voice tempered and controlled. "I feared that the events at the church would reach you swiftly. Pray tell me, what can be done?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Madame, I assure you that every precaution has been noted, and the threat upon the undertaker has not gone unnoticed. It is of immediate concern to us to determine the nature of this, shall we say, silent influence. Your cooperation and the candour of your household will aid us considerably." The widow's eyes flickered to a small side table where lay correspondence, neat and deliberate. She motioned toward them. "These arrived this morning, addressed to my late husband. I believe some may be connected to his business, but one or two are curious in their tone." Holmes's hands moved over the letters with precision, noting the variation in ink, the differing pressures of the pen upon the paper. One letter bore a faint scent, reminiscent of the violets we had noted at the church. "Violet, you say?" I whispered to Holmes. "Indeed, Watson," he replied. "A recurrent motif, likely unintentional, yet telling. Observe the paper's watermark, Havisham and Pike, the same as the envelope delivered at St. Saviour's. The sender, it seems, maintains a penchant for consistency." He examined the folds, the slight crumpling of the edges, and the absence of fingerprints. "Not only is this individual meticulous in threats, but he is careful to mask his presence. Yet care can never fully extinguish self. Let us proceed." Holmes next led us to the drawing-room, where a small assembly of Mr. Penrith's closest acquaintances had gathered. Among them was Mr. Felix Arden, the nephew, whose expression was guarded yet uneasy, and Mr. Gregory Vale, the business partner, whose eyes darted like birds at sudden movement. Holmes's attention was immediate. He noted the pattern of their gloves, the soil upon their boots, the faint sheen of perspiration on Vale's brow, despite the cold, and the subtle shift in Arden's posture, as if bracing for accusation. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, "I would be obliged by your cooperation. No detail is trivial, and every movement, every phrase, may illuminate the obscured path before us. Let us begin with the funeral itself. I understand it was observed in silence?" "Yes," Arden replied. "The letter forbade any word. Reverend Clay, though shaken, obeyed it. There was no reading of Scripture beyond what could be muttered internally, and no sermon was delivered." Holmes's fingers tapped the arm of the chair. "An obedience born of fear, doubtless, and yet, tell me, did any of you notice any unusual behavior among the congregation? Any nervous gestures, glances, or hasty movements?" Vale cleared his throat. "Merely that the mourners were excessively cautious. One elderly gentleman nearly stumbled upon the snow-covered path, but no one assisted him, perhaps due to the threat." Holmes's eyes glimmered with that quiet intensity that always presaged revelation. "Exactly so. Fear governs motion as it does silence. But motion is not entirely absent. Consider the undertaker's death. A man who dies without marks, in undisturbed snow, cannot be merely the victim of chance. We have an instrument, deliberate action, and yet the absence of direct violence suggests ingenuity, not brutality." He rose and moved toward the hearth, warming his gloved hands. "We must examine the household more closely, and the routes by which outsiders might approach. The boy who delivered the threat, the obscured movements, and the peculiarity of the violet-scented communication, all these indicate planning, premeditation, and a mind accustomed to control. We are dealing with a craftsman of fear, Watson, not a mere criminal." I followed him to the rear garden, noting the same careful inspection of the snow, the paths, the subtle depressions that marked a sliding of the heavy bier within the churchyard. Holmes knelt, tracing the fine powder with his gloved finger. "Salt and pumice, my dear Watson, the same abrasive we saw at the church. Our perpetrator is consistent. Observe the circle of untouched snow around the body. This, coupled with the precise application of the abrasive, shows forethought. The path of entry, the timing, and the precautions against witnesses, remarkable." Holmes stood suddenly, his face illuminated by the lantern. "Come, we shall interview the household further and inspect Mr. Penrith's private papers. There are ledgers, letters, and a collection of accounts that may reveal motive, or at least hint at the possible identity of our silent manipulator. The beauty of deduction lies in assembling fragments until the picture is no longer blurred. Every shadow, every silence, and every footstep is part of the grand mosaic. And tonight, Watson, we begin to see its edges." With that, we returned indoors, the wind now rising as if to challenge our intrusion into the quiet calculation of the perpetrator. Holmes's pace quickened, and though I could scarcely keep up, I noted the intensity in his gaze, the absolute focus, and the subtle thrill that accompanies a mind on the brink of revelation. The stage had been set, the characters assembled, and the first threads of the mystery had been plucked from the weave of London's frost-laden evening. The case of the silent funeral had begun in earnest, and already I felt that we were but at the threshold of secrets that would test every measure of observation, patience, and intellect we possessed. Holmes's attention to detail in Mr. Penrith's household was immediate and uncompromising. He moved with a precision that made every servant, guest, and observer seem an accessory to his inspection rather than a participant in their own right. I followed closely, notebook in hand, attempting to record impressions even as my mind struggled to keep pace with his. In the library, the late afternoon light slanted across shelves of leather-bound volumes, each book placed with meticulous regularity, the dust absent where a hand had perhaps just lingered. Holmes's eyes flicked from spine to spine, noting tiny abrasions, the occasional fingerprint invisible to all but him, and the faintest hint of a chemical residue upon the polished wood. "Watson," he said, lifting a hand to draw my attention, "observe the faint trace of powdered chalk upon the edge of that desk. It is not accidental. The man who delivered the violet-scented letter, our anonymous mourner, must have handled something similar in preparation for his approach. Chalk is used in surveying, in marking distances, and sometimes to dull the sound of steps. The subtlety of these traces indicates a mind that foresees scrutiny, and yet leaves breadcrumbs for those trained to read them." I bent closer, sniffing delicately, and detected the soft mineral scent he had indicated. It was almost imperceptible, yet there it was, a whisper of intention. Holmes drew a small magnifying lens from his coat and examined the edges of the desk, turning it this way and that to catch the light. He traced his gloved finger along a groove in the wood, his eyes alight. "A deposit of pumice, Watson. Again the same abrasive we observed at the church. Our perpetrator is consistent in method, though divergent in setting. Observe further, this desk bears signs of recent handling, papers shuffled, letters perhaps exchanged and replaced with careful attention. The act was deliberate, the timing precise." He then moved to a tall sideboard against the wall, lifting a small, unremarkable box. Opening it, he revealed an assortment of keys, each marked with letters in a clerkly hand. One key, tarnished and worn, bore the initials A.P. "Alistair Penrith," he murmured. "Curious. The key shows frequent use. One wonders what it opens, perhaps a desk drawer, a safe, or a hidden compartment. I would wager, Watson, that this key, in conjunction with the letters, may reveal motive." I noted the careful arrangement and meticulous labeling. "You think someone might have accessed private papers to manipulate events?" I asked. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "Information is a weapon, as surely as a dagger or a gun. The letters and threats are merely the visible part of a far deeper strategy. Consider, too, the behavior of those present at the silent funeral. Subtle cues, Watson. The shifting of a hand, the avoidance of eye contact, a pause too long or a glance too quick. These are clues as tangible as footprints upon the snow." Our attention was then drawn to a small writing desk near the window, where a collection of ledgers and account books lay. Holmes leafed through them with the gentleness of a surgeon, noting entries, discrepancies, and handwriting variations. "Observe, Watson, these accounts. Mr. Penrith was meticulous, yet look here, entries in the last week of his life show corrections, cross-outs, and an unusual notation, Violet, deliver. The same phrase appears repeatedly in correspondence. Our mysterious mourner is communicating not only threats, but instructions and perhaps testing obedience or inducing fear. This is no casual act of malice. It is methodical, controlled, and intended to elicit a particular response." I looked over his shoulder at the pages, bewildered by the subtlety of the clues. "And you believe the undertaker's death is connected?" I asked. "Undoubtedly," Holmes said, closing the book. "He was a necessary instrument, one whose silence was required to maintain the theatre of fear. But consider, Watson, the absence of marks, the undisturbed snow, the precise circle of abrasives. This was not merely murder, it was choreography. Someone intended to control not just life, but perception." Holmes then moved toward the hearth, his eyes scanning the room as if seeking ghosts among the furniture. "We must also consider the human element," he added. "Felix Arden and Gregory Vale, the nephew and the partner, each stands to gain differently from Mr. Penrith's death. Yet neither has acted in haste. Their restraint is telling, Watson. They are aware of the threat, and yet they manoeuvre carefully, testing the bounds of what may be risked." As he spoke, Holmes's attention was caught by a small fragment of fabric caught in the latch of the window. He lifted it with delicate care, holding it to the light. "Violet indeed," he murmured. "A shred, yet corroborative. It matches the scent and colour motifs we have encountered. Whoever came here did so not in haste alone, but with calculation, clothing, timing, and delivery all coordinated. There is an intelligence behind these actions that rivals the average mind." We moved together to the study, where further letters lay unopened on the desk. Holmes examined them, noting the type of ink, the slant of the pen, and the spacing of the lines. "Inconsistent pressures," he said, "but uniform intent. The letters were written with care, then transported in a manner that minimized the risk of detection, yet inevitably even the most careful hand leaves a trace. And here, Watson, is our second clue of pattern. Each letter references either the funeral or the undertaker. Each includes a subtle mark, watermarks, scents, thread, powder, never in isolation. Always a constellation, a network of signals. I noted the meticulousness, marvelling at Holmes's ability to perceive the invisible. "And the next step, Holmes? What do you intend to do with these observations?" He smiled faintly, a gleam of purpose in his eyes. "We follow the threads, Watson. First, we ascertain how the letters were delivered, who may have had access, and the movements of each person present. Then we examine Mr. Penrith's business associates and household staff. Every person, every item, every mark has a story to tell. Tonight, we begin to gather that testimony. Silence need not be maintained in our presence. We shall speak and listen with all our faculties. Only then shall the web begin to unravel." A sudden knock at the door interrupted him. A servant entered, bowing. "Mr. Holmes, a man insists upon speaking with you, sir. Claims knowledge of the letters." Holmes's eyes sparkled with that subtle fire I had come to associate with anticipation. "Very well," he said. "Let him in. Every narrative has its messenger, Watson, and sometimes the messenger bears both the key and the lock." As the door opened, I glimpsed a man, middle-aged, shrouded in a thick coat, his breath misting in the cold air of the hall. Holmes's expression hardened, alert, yet poised. "You arrive opportunely," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit and speak. Every detail is precious, and your timing is most fortunate. Now, Watson, observe closely. The first conversation that may yield the truth, hidden beneath threat, and silence begins." The man who entered was of middle height, with a lined and nervous face that bore the weary pallor of one who had slept little and worried much. His hat remained in his trembling hands, his gaze shifting from Holmes to myself and back again. The light from the hearth revealed a damp sheen upon his forehead, though the night outside was bitter enough to chill one's marrow. There was fear in him, but also a restless urgency, a man caught between guilt and dread. Holmes regarded him with quiet curiosity, his lean figure half-shadowed, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the stranger with the measured stillness of a hawk before the strike. "You claim to have knowledge of the letters," said Holmes softly. "Pray be seated. Your name?" "Caleb Finch, sir," came the reply, voice hoarse and uncertain. "I am, or was, an assistant to Mr. Penrith's clerk in his shipping office at Limehouse. When the old gentleman passed, I thought perhaps it was right that I come forward." There are things I've seen these past months, things I'd rather not have been mixed up in." Holmes motioned for him to continue, the faintest incline of his head encouraging the man to unburden himself. I noticed Holmes's gaze drift momentarily to Finch's right cuff, where a faint dusting of white powder clung to the fabric. He said nothing of it yet, but I knew it had not escaped his observation. Finch licked his lips nervously. "It began before the death, sir. There were parcels, heavy ones. The master, Mr. Penrith, had them brought from the docks, but kept no record in the ledgers, nor were they opened in the warehouse. He sent me to deliver some myself, to a chapel out near Northumberland Heath, the same where his funeral was held. Always after dark, always with instructions that I was to knock twice and wait until a hand passed through the door to take it. I never saw the face." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. And did you notice any particular markings upon the parcels, or scents?" "Yes, sir," Finch answered immediately. "A faint, sweet smell, like the one in the church tonight, if I'm not mistaken. And when the light struck the wrapping, it showed a shimmer, almost metallic. The crates were sealed with a violet wax, bearing no crest, only a circle within a circle. He warned me never to speak of it, said it was connected to a charitable fund, but I never believed that." Holmes's fingers drummed lightly upon the mantel. "A charitable fund that delivers sealed parcels to a church at midnight, accompanied by threats written on stationery from Havisham and Pike?" "I think not, Mr. Finch. And these deliveries, when did they cease?" "The last was 3 nights before he died," said Finch, lowering his voice. "I took the box myself, as usual. When I returned, I found the office door ajar, and the master inside, sitting as if struck dumb. There was a letter open before him, the same blue vellum, sir, and a look upon his face I shall never forget. He burned the letter, but not before I saw the words at the bottom. 'The mourner hears everything.'" At this, Holmes's expression sharpened to that hawk-like stillness I knew well. "You saw those words clearly?" "Clear as day, sir." He dismissed me, trembling all the while. After that he refused visitors, spoke to no one but his nephew, and ordered a funeral plot to be prepared weeks before he died. Almost as if— Finch hesitated, his eyes darting toward me, as though fearing to voice his thought aloud. "As if he anticipated the need," Holmes finished for him. "Indeed, the silence of the funeral was not chance, it was a design, a performance arranged before the curtain even rose. Watson though I was, I could not conceal my bewilderment." "Holmes, are you suggesting Mr. Penrith staged his own silence?" Holmes turned from the hearth, the faintest curve of a smile ghosting his lips. "I am suggesting, my dear Watson, that the silent funeral was the consequence of a man who feared that sound itself might summon his undoing. He knew something, or someone, listened." Finch looked up sharply. "Listened, sir?" "Yes," Holmes said. "Not with ears, perhaps, but with eyes, influence and surveillance of a kind subtle enough to choke a man's will without laying hands upon him. Your description of the circle within a circle, the mark on the wax, is most interesting. It suggests ritual, secrecy, perhaps even fraternity. We are dealing with an organization, Watson, not a single murderer." I watched Holmes pace slowly, the firelight throwing long shadows across the walls. He stopped before Finch once more. "One final question. Did you see anyone near the chapel during your deliveries? A caretaker, a watchman, anyone?" Finch hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Once, a tall man in a dark coat, his hat pulled low, gloves on his hands though the night was mild. I heard him humming softly. Funeral music, sir." I turned back to the road as quick as I could. Holmes's brow furrowed in thought. The undertaker's death, the muffled bells, the powder of pumice and salt, all acts of orchestration. But for what purpose? Silence alone gains nothing unless it conceals an exchange or protects a secret yet undiscovered. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And yet, perhaps it was not silence they sought, but substitution. Substitution, I repeated, precisely. Suppose, Watson, that the funeral stillness served to disguise, not absence, but replacement. A coffin delivered, its contents not what they seemed. The undertaker, privy to the switch, would have to be silenced thereafter, but not by violence. Chloroform, perhaps, or suffocation by vapour, leaving no mark. The pumice bed was no mere precaution against footprints. It was part of the ritual concealment. Finch shuddered visibly. Then the coffin may not have contained the dead man you buried, Holmes said. Or if it did, he was not alone. He turned suddenly toward the window. Lestrade must be recalled at once. We return to St. Saviour's tonight, Watson. If the church is still guarded, we shall request entrance. If not, we shall enter regardless. There are secrets under that nave which daylight has not touched. Holmes pressed a sovereign into Finch's trembling hand. You have done wisely to speak, Mr. Finch. For your safety, say nothing of this interview, not even to your own conscience. The man who hears everything may yet have ears in this house. As the door closed behind Finch, the room seemed to grow smaller, the air heavier. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, listening, not to sound, but to the quiet hum of thought that filled the space. Then, with a swift motion, he reached for his coat and hat. Watson, he said quietly, this is no ordinary case of vengeance or deceit. We tread upon a boundary between the living and the dead, or at least between what men choose to bury and what they dare not speak of. Bring your revolver and your nerve. We return to the church before the hour is out. And so we went again into the whitened night, the lamps of Northumberland Heath flickering like dying embers in the distance, while the silence around us pressed closer with every step, as though the very darkness had learned to listen. The night had grown still as stone when we reached St. Saviour's once more. The fog had lifted, leaving the air bitterly clear. Moonlight spilled like silver dust upon the graveyard, catching the outlines of snow-capped stones and the black ribs of yews. Not a sound stirred, save the slow ticking of the church's old clock. Even Lestrade's voice, low and irritable, seemed subdued beneath the solemn weight of the place. He was pacing at the porch when we arrived, his breath visible in sharp clouds. "You're back already, Mr. Holmes," said he, rubbing his hands together. "I've kept the church sealed, just as you instructed. Nothing moved in or out, unless ghosts do so without leave." "They often do," Holmes replied, stepping into the nave with that measured calm which no darkness ever disturbed. "And yet I trust the living more than spirits for mischief. Come, Watson, our inquiry begins where silence began." We passed between the pews, our lanterns drawing long, swaying shadows upon the floor. The same oppressive hush that had haunted the funeral seemed to linger still, as though the air itself retained obedience to the written threat. Holmes paused beneath the chancel arch and gazed toward the altar, his eyes narrowing as they swept over the flagstones. "Lestrade," he said quietly, "you told me no one approached the body, save the physician and yourself." "Correct, sir. Keene was found here." Lestrade gestured toward the northern path visible through the window. "No one else touched him." "Then someone has been less disciplined since your departure," Holmes murmured. He lowered his lantern and pointed to a faint smear upon the cold stone, a dull grey streak, minute yet unmistakable. Salt mixed with fine soot, and the mark of a boot heel brushed away too carelessly. Someone returned after the body was removed. Recently, too, the air here still holds the scent of paraffin. We exchanged glances. I felt a strange tightening in my chest, as if the walls themselves leaned inward, listening. Holmes knelt beside the mark, producing his magnifying lens. The residue is new, and the pattern, yes, consistent with the abrasive we found earlier. Whoever this visitor was, he knew precisely where to tread. See, Watson, how the trace stops abruptly at the vestry door. Our quarry either entered there or vanished altogether. Lestrade drew his revolver with a muttered oath. I'll have a look inside. Gently, Inspector, Holmes cautioned. A door that has been opened in stealth seldom welcomes noise. He pressed his palm to the latch. The hinges creaked faintly, revealing the same cramped chamber where we had earlier examined the muffled chest and the frayed bell rope. Yet now something new intruded upon the order of the room. A faint displacement in the dust near the far wall, where the floor met the heavy wainscoting. Holmes raised his lantern and stooped low. "A draught," he whispered. "From beneath the panel, a concealed space, perhaps." I watched as he produced his thin-bladed knife and traced it along the edge of the wooden panel. A minute's patient effort, and the board gave with a subdued groan, revealing a narrow cavity behind. Within lay a small wooden box, unmarked, secured by a simple brass clasp. Holmes drew it out carefully and set it upon the table. Lestrade whistled softly. "Now what in heaven's name is this doing here?" Holmes made no answer. He examined the clasp with care, then lifted it. Inside lay 3 objects: a folded letter sealed in violet wax, a tiny vial half filled with clear liquid, and a small scrap of fabric, torn and singed at one edge. The scent that rose from the box was faint but unmistakable, violets and camphor. "The pattern continues," Holmes said quietly. "Violet, camphor and salt, each thread woven with intention. Let us examine the letter." He broke the seal. The handwriting, neat and deliberate, was identical to that of the earlier threats. "To the Keeper of Silence. The substitution is complete. Speak not, or the buried will answer." Holmes read the words twice, then folded the page with an expression that I could not decipher. "This, Watson, is both a confession and a command. Whoever placed this here wished to communicate with an accomplice who would return later for instruction or reassurance. The phrasing implies a completed act. The substitution is complete. We are now certain that the coffin contained more than the remains of Alistair Penrith." Lestrade frowned. "Then what, or who, was added to it?" Holmes looked up sharply. "That, Inspector, is the question upon which the case turns. But note the subtlety of this message. It assumes a reader complicit enough to obey silence, yet fearful enough to return here. In darkness, we may still intercept him." He checked his watch. "It is 10:30. The hour of the funeral was 3, dusk at 5. The undertaker died soon after. Our correspondent's last visit may have occurred between 7 and 9. Superstition thrives on pattern, and such minds are slaves to habit. I propose we wait." We extinguished our lanterns and withdrew behind the choir screen, where the air was heavy with the scent of wax and age. The minutes stretched, each marked only by the slow, methodical tolling of the clock. At length, the faint crunch of snow reached us through the open crack of the vestry door. A cautious step, then another. A lantern's muted glow flickered against the frosted glass. Holmes's hand touched my arm. "Now, Watson, quietly." The door creaked. A figure slipped inside, cloaked and hooded, moving with the wary grace of one accustomed to concealment. The lantern's light fell upon gloved hands that went straight to the table, fumbling for the hidden panel. Holmes's whisper brushed my ear. "Steady, my dear fellow, we must see what he seeks before we act." The stranger drew the panel aside and retrieved the box. For a moment he stared at it, then, apparently satisfied, produced a new envelope from his coat and placed it where the first had lain. As he turned, Holmes stepped forward soundlessly. "Good evening," he said. The man froze, his lantern fell, shattering upon the floor. In the dim spill of oil flame I glimpsed his face, a lean countenance, pale as parchment, framed by a clerical collar. It was the Reverend Clay. For an instant he seemed incapable of speech, then whispered hoarsely, "You should not have come. It is not safe here." "Indeed," Holmes replied coolly, stooping to snatch the fallen envelope. "And yet you return willingly to the scene of a murder. That is seldom the habit of innocence." "Perhaps you will explain the meaning of this substitution, Reverend, before your silence becomes permanent?" Clay's eyes darted toward the door, then to the flames guttering near the box. "You do not understand," he gasped. "There was no murder, only a warning. Penrith's death was ordained, and his secret with him. The undertaker knew too much. He saw what lay within the coffin." Holmes's expression did not change, but his voice dropped to a whisper like a blade. "And what was that, Reverend?" Clay's lips trembled. "Not what, Mr. Holmes? Who?" A long stillness followed, the kind that chills more deeply than any wind. Holmes's eyes gleamed hard and sharp. "Then, Watson," he said softly, "our silent funeral buried two souls that day, and one of them may yet be alive." For a long moment the silence between us was more terrible than the confession itself. The church seemed to hold its breath. Even the old timbers ceased their groaning, as if fearful of disturbing the revelation. Reverend Clay stood trembling, his hands clutched before him, the light from the guttering oil casting a wavering halo around his white collar. Holmes did not move. His gaze, sharp and unwavering, fixed upon the clergyman with that peculiar intensity which seemed to draw truth from the very air. "Two souls," Holmes repeated softly. "You will explain that statement, Reverend, without evasion. Who shared Mr. Penrith's grave?" The vicar's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he sank into the nearest chair, pressing a hand to his brow. "You cannot understand," he murmured, his voice brittle as glass. "It was not murder, it was fear, necessity, perhaps mercy. Mr. Penrith foresaw what was coming. He begged me to perform the service exactly as instructed, to bury him in silence, without prayer, without proclamation. I thought it madness. I see now it was despair." Holmes advanced a step, his tone low and measured. "And the other? Who was laid beside him?" Clay's eyes lifted at last, haunted and hollow. "A woman," he whispered, "young, pale as death when I saw her. He said she was his ward, though no record of her existed. She had been ill, confined in secrecy. The physicians called it catalepsy, but there was more to it. He feared that if word reached his partner, Mr. Vale, or his nephew, Mr. Arden, her existence would destroy them all." Holmes's fingers tightened upon the edge of the table. "So he buried her alive to preserve a secret?" Clay flinched, as if struck. No, I swear she was beyond aid. I touched her hand myself. It was cold, lifeless. He placed her in the coffin with him, saying they should not be parted even in death. I protested, but he swore upon his soul that she was gone. I performed the rites in silence as he demanded. The threat, if a word be spoken another will die, arrived that very morning. I thought it a cruel jest meant to ensure obedience. His voice faltered. But when the undertaker fell dead that evening, I knew the curse was real. Holmes regarded him steadily, his features unreadable. "A curse rarely travels by post, Reverend. Fear makes accomplices of those who see too little. The threat was no divine warning, but a calculated reinforcement of terror, a human hand enforcing human silence. Lestrade, who had until now stood rigid with disbelief, gave a low whistle. "Then what of this second burial? Are you saying there's a woman lying there with Penrith this very night?" Holmes nodded slowly. "It would appear so. But whether she lies still or not, we shall determine before dawn." He turned sharply to Clay. "You will tell me everything that transpired on the day of the funeral. Omit nothing, not the order of the mourners nor who handled the coffin." The vicar's hands trembled as he spoke. "The coffin arrived shortly after noon, brought by Mr. Vale's men. The undertaker supervised its placement, but he seemed troubled. He said it was heavier than expected. Mr. Vale dismissed his concern, claiming the casket was lined with iron to preserve the remains. The mourners gathered in silence. When I lifted the prayer book to speak, Mr. Vale stopped me. He said the instructions forbade it, and so I stood dumb before the grave while they lowered the coffin into the earth." Holmes's eyes gleamed like steel catching fire. "Vale again. The man profits most from Penrith's death, both in business and in silence. The undertaker's unease, the absence of sound, the deliberate intimidation, all designed to conceal a substitution." He turned to Lestrade, his voice quickening with suppressed energy. "We shall exhume the coffin at once. I care not for warrants. The night is our ally, and truth seldom waits upon bureaucracy." Lestrade hesitated only briefly before yielding to the authority in Holmes's tone. "Very well, I'll fetch the gravedigger and a spade, but if this goes wrong, I'll have the whole yard on my neck." Holmes gave a thin smile. "If we succeed, Inspector, you shall have the yard at your feet." Within the hour, under the pale vigilance of the moon, we stood again in the churchyard. The snow had crusted over the mound, and the frost bit cruelly at our fingers. The gravedigger, a taciturn fellow summoned from his nearby cottage, worked in silence save for the dull scrape of metal against frozen earth. Holmes stood beside him, the lantern's light sharpening the angles of his face into something almost spectral. I could see that he was listening, not to the sounds of labour, but to the rhythm beneath them, as though measuring the pulse of the ground itself. At last, the coffin's lid came into view, a dark oblong gleaming faintly under the lantern light. Lestrade signalled the man to pause. "Now, Mr. Holmes, if there's any trickery here, we'll soon see it." Holmes knelt, brushing away the remaining soil. His gloved fingers traced the seam of the lid. "Note the scratches here, Watson," he murmured. "Not from tools of burial, but from within. The nails have been disturbed, recently, and from the inside." A chill passed through me like the hand of death itself. "Good heavens, Holmes, are you suggesting—" "That she was not dead, but placed here breathing," he said grimly, "and that someone returned to retrieve her." He pointed to faint impressions in the damp soil around the grave, narrow, deep, as though made by a wheeled frame. "The bier, Watson, it was used not merely to bring the coffin in, but to take something out. The abrasive powder we found earlier confirms it. The same pattern lies here. The second occupant was removed under cover of night." Lestrade swore under his breath. "Then who in blazes did we bury?" "Perhaps," said Holmes softly, "only the corpse that made her freedom possible." He rose to his full height, his expression fierce with thought. "There remains one man who can tell us what was taken and why, Gregory Vale. We shall pay him a visit before the dawn breaks, but not through the front door, Watson. The hour for courtesy has passed. I have no wish to announce myself to a man who arranges funerals for the living." The gravedigger crossed himself and turned away. Holmes replaced the disturbed soil with a care almost reverential. "Let the dead rest," he murmured. Our business is with those who traded life for silence, and I mean to know before the morning bell tolls whose voice still whispers in that grave." He turned, the wind tugging at his coat, and started toward the road. I followed in silence, the lantern swinging between us, its light glinting across the frozen stones. Behind us, the church loomed black against the snow, its tower a sentinel to secrets too long buried. Somewhere beyond the hill, in the shadowed depths of the heath, a dog began to howl, long, mournful, and low, as if warning us that what waited in the darkness ahead was not yet ready to be unearthed. The road to Vale's residence wound through a stretch of frost-bitten heath, where the moonlight pooled in silver hollows and the air was heavy with stillness. The crunch of our boots upon the frozen path was the only sound that disturbed the quiet. Holmes walked ahead, his figure long and dark against the whitened ground, his every step deliberate, as though he followed not the visible road, but some invisible logic only he could trace. The wind carried the faint tolling of a distant bell, a lonely echo that seemed to mark the hour not of time, but of consequence. "Holmes," I said at last, lowering my voice as though the night itself might overhear. "You mean to confront Vale directly?" "The man will deny everything. We have nothing yet but inference." Holmes did not turn. "Inference, my dear Watson, is the marrow of truth. Facts are merely its bones. We shall provide the flesh before." "Dawn! Mr. Gregory Vale is the architect of this silence. His is the hand that turns the wheel, while others merely push it." He paused briefly, glancing toward a cluster of dim lights glimmering through the mist. "His house stands yonder. Note the symmetry of its windows and the absence of smoke from the chimneys. A household awake, yet pretending to sleep. That, Watson, is guilt's own handwriting upon the night." As we approached, I observed the building, an austere Georgian structure with a portico half buried under ivy, the steps rimed with frost. No servants moved within, only a single lamp glowed faintly through the curtains of the upper study. Holmes motioned for silence and approached the side gate, which yielded under his hand without protest. "Unlocked," he murmured, a man expecting no visitors, or one confident that none would dare intrude. He moved with cat-like precision along the gravel, crouching by a side window. With a deft motion, he drew from his pocket a narrow instrument and eased the latch. A moment later, we were inside. The room smelled faintly of stale tobacco and the faint sweetness of wax polish. On the desk stood a brandy decanter, half-drained, beside a sheaf of open correspondence. Holmes moved to the fireplace, where the ashes were still faintly warm. "He burned something recently?" he observed. "But not entirely." He stirred the remains with the poker and retrieved a corner of half-charred parchment. Holding it to the lamplight, he read aloud in a low tone. "Payment received. Consignment delivered. Witness silenced." Holmes's eyes glimmered. "You see, Watson, the vocabulary of commerce extended into death. This is our missing link between the silent funeral and the motive." Before I could reply, there came a faint sound from beyond the adjoining corridor, the creak of a board, cautious and deliberate. Holmes's hand went up instantly, signaling silence. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The faint rhythm of footsteps passed by, then paused. A shadow lengthened beneath the door, then receded. "He's not alone," Holmes whispered. "The hour is late for visitors of good conscience. Let us oblige him to declare his company." He opened the door a fraction and peered through. The corridor beyond was dimly lit by a single wall lamp. At the far end, a door stood ajar. From within came the faint rustle of paper, and the sound of someone speaking in a low, urgent tone. Holmes beckoned, and we advanced noiselessly, our boots muffled by the carpet runner. As we neared the door, a voice became distinct, Vale's, unmistakably, though strained by agitation. "You swore she'd never be found," he hissed. "You promised the grave would close upon both. And now Holmes prowls like a hound at the scent. You've ruined everything." Another voice answered, fainter but tremulous. "I told you it was dangerous. She was alive when they buried her. I heard her breath." A sharp crack interrupted the whisper, the sound of a fist striking flesh. Holmes flung the door wide. Vale, tall and grim, stood over a woman crumpled in a chair, his face flushed with rage. The moment he saw us, his composure shattered. He stumbled back, his hand darting toward a drawer. Holmes crossed the space between them in 2 strides and seized his wrist with iron precision. "Enough theatrics, Mr. Vale," he said coldly. "Your play has reached its final act." The man struggled but found himself pinned by Holmes's grip. "What right? What proof?" "Proof?" Holmes interrupted. "You mistake me, sir. I have no need to prove what you have already confessed. You fear discovery not because you are innocent, but because you have been overheard." He gestured toward the trembling woman, who raised her head weakly. She was young, perhaps 25, with pallid cheeks and eyes wide from terror. A scarf was bound around her wrist where a bruise had begun to darken. "Miss," Holmes said gently, "you need not fear. I am here to uncover the truth of the funeral and the fate of the woman buried there. Tell me, what part did you play in this?" She hesitated, her voice barely audible. "I was the nurse. Mr. Penrith's ward was under my care. He said she suffered seizures, fits of sleep that mimicked death. I begged him to summon a physician when she collapsed, but he refused. Then Mr. Vale came. He told me the girl was gone and ordered me to prepare her body for burial. But Her eyes filled with tears. I saw her breathe. Lestrade, who had followed us in, uttered a sharp exclamation. "Good Lord, then she was alive!" Holmes's expression remained grave. "And what did you do, madam?" "I told Vale," she sobbed. "He said I must be mistaken. The next morning the coffin was sealed, and I never saw her again." Holmes turned to Vale, whose defiance faltered beneath that unrelenting gaze. "You ensured her disappearance, then? You moved the coffin's true occupant and left Penrith's body to conceal the crime. But why? What could compel such monstrous deception?" Vale's composure broke at last. "Money," he spat. "You think Penrith was a saint? He ruined lives. The girl was proof, his illegitimate daughter. Her existence would have destroyed his reputation, mine and the firm. When she fell ill, I saw a chance to end the scandal. She was weak, unconscious. He insisted she be buried beside him. I agreed, then arranged for her to be taken away afterward. She was alive when we dug her out, Holmes, alive and silent. I sent her abroad. She'll speak to no one again." The words hung in the air like frost. For once, even Holmes seemed momentarily shaken. "And the undertaker?" he asked quietly. "He threatened to tell the police. He wanted payment. I gave it, then saw to it that his heart failed soon after." Lestrade stepped forward, snapping the cuffs around Vale's wrists. "Gregory Vale, I arrest you for the murder of Thomas Keene and for conspiracy to conceal the unlawful burial of a living person." Holmes watched him passively as the man was led away. Then he turned to me, his voice low, but weighted with something almost mournful. "Watson, there are crimes that stink of money and others that reek of fear. This one reeks of both, and yet beneath it all there lies pity. A woman's silence bought with gold, a grave mistaken for a refuge. I fancy, before this is done, we may yet find her, and hear what that silence truly meant. Outside, the first faint light of dawn bled into the sky. Holmes stood at the gate, his breath curling white in the chill air, and gazed back at the dark house behind us. "Come, Watson," he said at last. "The case is far from closed. The living still wait to be unearthed." We left Gregory Vale's house just as the horizon began to lighten, a pale glow spreading across the frost-bound fields. The air had that strange clarity which follows the darkest hour, a deceptive peace that seemed to mock the weight of what we had uncovered. Holmes walked in silence beside me, his expression fixed and unreadable, his collar turned up against the cold. Lestrade had remained behind to secure the prisoner and collect his statement, but Holmes's restlessness betrayed no satisfaction in victory. There was something unfinished, something that gnawed beneath the surface of his composure. At length I ventured, "Surely the matter is resolved now. Vale's confession confirms your theory. The girl was buried alive and later removed. Justice, grim as it is, will have its course." Holmes did not slow his pace. "You are too generous to the inspector's appetite for closure, Watson. Vale's confession is a performance, not an end. Consider the inconsistencies. The letter in the vestry declaring the substitution is complete was not addressed to Vale, but to the keeper of silence. Vale would never describe himself in such mystical terms. The vocabulary of threat we have seen bears a mind more poetic, more ritualistic. No, there is another hand behind the curtain, a hand that still moves the strings." I frowned. But what purpose could such elaborate cruelty serve? The blackmail motive is clear, and Vale's guilt undeniable. Holmes's voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "Guilt and control, Watson, are not synonymous. A puppet's crime seldom exonerates the puppeteer." We had reached the main road by then, the village beginning to stir faintly, chimneys smoking, a cart creaking toward the market. Yet even as the first signs of life returned, the atmosphere remained heavy, as though the night had left its shadow upon the earth. Holmes stopped suddenly at the bend where the church spire rose above the mist. "Before dawn fully breaks," he said, "we shall pay one last visit to St. Saviour's. I wish to confirm something left unanswered." I followed him without question. The church stood solemn as before, the frost glittering upon the gates and the snow unbroken save for our earlier footprints. Within, the silence pressed more keenly than ever. Holmes walked straight to the vestry, his lantern sweeping the walls, floor, and furnishings with methodical precision. He paused before the small table where the hidden panel had once concealed the box. It was now empty, yet his attention lingered upon the grain of the wood, his expression tightening. "Watson, do you recall the faint draught I remarked upon here?" "Yes, beneath the wainscoting." "Precisely. But what struck me as peculiar then strikes me as decisive now. The air was cold, not stagnant, implying an open passage beneath. Observe." He knelt, tapping along the baseboard until a hollow echo answered his touch. A moment later, his knife slid between two panels, and with a faint groan the section of wall gave way, revealing a narrow aperture leading into blackness. A chill breath of damp air escaped. "Good heavens," I murmured. "A tunnel." "A vault," Holmes corrected, lowering his lantern. "Constructed beneath the church, likely forgotten by most of its parishioners, yet our keeper of silence remembers it well." He descended without hesitation, and I followed, the stone steps slick with frost. The air below was heavy with the scent of earth and old stone. The passage opened into a low chamber, its walls lined with shelves that had once held bones. But the bones were gone. In their place stood wooden crates and boxes, sealed with the same violet wax we had seen before. Holmes moved from one to the next, examining the labels, each marked only by a single initial. V for Vale, he murmured, A for Arden, P for Penrith, and here C for Clay. All the conspirators catalogued, their secrets preserved like relics. He prized open one of the lids with a small iron lever. Inside lay papers, neatly stacked, and upon them a thin film of white dust. He lifted one sheet and scanned it briefly. Contracts, bank transfers, deeds of sale, all forged or manipulated. Penrith's empire was built not upon commerce, but coercion. Vale and Arden were his partners, and when the machine began to falter, he sought to destroy the evidence through burial. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Then the girl, the supposed daughter, was never the cause but another victim. Holmes nodded grimly. Precisely. Her existence was the final thread holding their alliance together. When she learned too much, she became both leverage and liability. Vale sought to silence her, Penrith to protect her. The compromise was death in appearance only, but something went awry. She lived, was hidden away, and now— He stopped abruptly, turning his lantern toward the far wall. A faint sound reached us, a soft, rhythmic tapping, distant but distinct. It came from beyond the stone. Holmes froze, every muscle alert. The tapping ceased, then resumed, 3 slow knocks followed by silence. "Someone is there," I whispered. Holmes's expression hardened, or something left behind. He pressed his ear to the wall, then began feeling along the mortar with swift, deliberate movements. Finding a loose section, he drew it out, widening the gap enough to peer through. The lantern light revealed a small adjoining chamber, and in its center a figure seated against the wall, motionless but upright. The faint reflection of the flame glinted on pale skin and disheveled hair. "My word," I gasped. "Is she alive?" Holmes did not answer. He widened the breach and stepped through, crouching beside the figure. It was indeed a woman, young, fair, and thin to the point of fragility. Her eyes fluttered open at the intrusion, reflecting the light like those of one long accustomed to darkness. She drew a breath that trembled on the edge of a sob. "You need not fear," Holmes said gently. "You are among friends. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We mean you no harm." Her lips moved, the words emerging as a whisper, barely audible. "He said they would never find me." "Who said so?" Holmes pressed. Her eyes shifted toward the floor, where a scrap of violet fabric lay beside her, a ribbon tied once perhaps around a letter or lock of hair. "The man who buried me," she murmured. "The one they called the Keeper. He brought me here when the earth grew too cold, told me I was safe, that the world above had forgotten." Holmes looked at me sharply. "Then the Keeper yet lives, Watson. Vale was but a pawn." He turned back to her. "Do you know his name?" She shook her head weakly. "He wore the robes of a priest, but not the one who prayed." A tremor passed through the chamber. Above us, a faint creak echoed, the sound of a door closing somewhere in the church. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once. In the sudden dark, I heard only the faint rasp of his voice. "He is here." The chill deepened. From the stairway came the soft shuffle of steps descending, deliberate and slow, like a man certain of his ground. Holmes's hand brushed mine, steady but taut with resolve. "Remain still," he whispered. "The Keeper of Silence comes to count his ghosts." The faint scrape of the descending steps froze every muscle in my body. The woman's shallow breathing quickened beside us, and I felt, rather than saw, Holmes's hand tighten briefly on my arm. The lantern lay dark at our feet. The only light came from the dull reflection of the frost outside the narrow vent above, painting a thin, silver edge upon Holmes's profile. The footfalls came steadily, unhurried, as if the intruder already knew what he would find below. Holmes leaned close enough that I caught his whisper. When he passes the arch, seize the lantern and raise it full. Let him believe he's caught us unawares. Truth is best drawn from surprise. A figure appeared in the mouth of the stairway, tall, robed in black. At first glance he might have been mistaken for the vicar, but the movement, the stance, the very silence that preceded his words marked him as something colder, deliberate, almost mechanical. He paused at the bottom step and raised a hand. "You should not have come here," he said. His voice was soft, low, and strangely resonant, the kind that carried in whispers rather than echoes. "This is consecrated ground." Holmes stepped forward, and with a quick motion I lifted the lantern. The flame flared, spilling golden light across the stone. The man flinched slightly, his eyes gleaming through the shadow of his hood. And then, as the light steadied, I saw his face. It was Reverend Clay, or rather, something that had been Reverend Clay, but now seemed emptied of warmth, his features drawn and colourless, the calm of the pulpit replaced by a disquieting detachment. Holmes did not appear surprised. He inclined his head with a measured politeness. "Indeed, Reverend, I feared we might disturb you at prayer. Tell me, is it your custom to keep vigil over buried evidence, as well as buried souls?" Clay's eyes flickered toward the woman crouched beside the wall. She shrank back, pressing her hands over her mouth. "You found her," he murmured. "Then all must end tonight. It was not meant for discovery." "Few sins are," Holmes said dryly. "Your part in this masquerade was well concealed. Threats, silence, even death. But why perpetuate the illusion after Penrith's passing? What did you gain by keeping her hidden?" Clay's expression shifted. A tremor passed through his voice, though it never rose above that eerie calm. "Because she is the last voice of what he did. You cannot imagine the weight of her words. She saw, she knew how they built their empire on ruin. When the firm collapsed, she would have destroyed every one of them, Vale included. Penrith swore she would be safe only in silence. He begged me to guard that silence after death, to keep the world from hearing her truth." Holmes's eyes glinted with something that might have been pity, or only sharper comprehension. "And you obeyed, but obedience turned to fanaticism. When the undertaker learned too much, you made an example of him. Chloroform in the air, salt to mask the ground, a death without struggle. You played at divine judgment, Reverend." Clay's lips twitched, the faintest ghost of a smile. "You think me a murderer. I am only a keeper of peace. Words can destroy more lives than poison, Mr. Holmes. This girl's testimony would have damned every name in that ledger above you. Better that she sleep here, unseen." Holmes took a step closer, his tone tightening. "Sleep? You call it that? You sealed her beneath the church like an artifact and prayed she would forget she lived. But she remembers, Reverend. She remembers everything. You've mistaken cruelty for salvation." For the first time, Clay's composure wavered. His gaze darted between us, then upward to the narrow vent where the faintest hint of dawn crept through. "You do not understand," he said, almost pleading. "There are men above us, men still alive, who would kill to keep their names unsullied. If she speaks, they will come for her again, and for me. Do you think the Yard can protect against what money commands?" Holmes's reply was curt. "I think truth commands more than coin. Step away from her, Reverend." Clay hesitated, and in that instant the fragile stillness shattered. With a sudden movement, he seized one of the crates beside him and hurled it toward the lantern. The light went out, plunging us into darkness. A sharp cry rose from the woman as the sound of Clay's retreat echoed up the stair. Holmes was already in pursuit, his footsteps swift and sure despite the gloom. I stayed long enough to steady the girl, then followed, the chill air cutting like a blade as we ascended. When I reached the nave, the dawn light was spilling through the stained glass, pale and spectral. Holmes stood near the open door, his revolver drawn, scanning the snow-covered churchyard beyond. "He's fled into the heath," Holmes said. "The man runs toward his own salvation, or perhaps his confession." We followed the trail, the prints clear and sharp upon the fresh crust of snow. The heath stretched out before us, a white expanse under a dullening sky. Ahead, a dark figure stumbled over the rise, his robe trailing like a shadow, torn loose. Holmes pressed forward without pause. "Clay," he called, "stop! You cannot outpace judgment." But the man neither turned nor slowed. The ground sloped downward toward the frozen stream that bordered the churchyard. I saw his foot catch upon a buried root, then a cry, brief and strangled, as he fell forward onto the ice. Holmes reached him seconds later. I arrived just behind, breathless, to find Clay half-conscious, his robe spread like a shroud. The ice beneath him cracked, groaning ominously. Holmes crouched beside him. "Your silence ends here, Reverend. Will you tell me who ordered it?" Clay's eyes opened, dull but lucid. "No one ordered," he whispered. "The sin was ours to keep. Vale wanted money, Penrith wanted secrecy, but I wanted peace." His hand twitched, reaching weakly toward Holmes's sleeve. "She will speak now. Guard her, Mr. Holmes. They will come for her still." The ice gave way with a brittle snap, swallowing the rest of his words. Holmes caught his arm, but the current seized the robe, dragging the man beneath. Within moments the surface stilled again, smooth, silent, final. Holmes remained kneeling at the edge, watching the ripples fade. Then he rose slowly, his breath clouding in the morning air. "There are few forms of silence, Watson, so absolute as that of a man who finally believes himself forgiven." He turned back toward the church, where the first light now struck the bell tower. "Come, we must see to the girl. The dead have had their requiem. Now the living must have their truth." As we retraced our steps across the snow, I glanced once more at the frozen stream. Beneath that thin white crust lay the last guardian of the secret, his vigil ended, his silence eternal. Yet I could not shake the feeling that somewhere in the stillness of the church behind us, the bells waited to ring for more than the dead. When we returned to the church, the first warmth of morning was spreading through the stained glass windows, casting fragments of red and amber light across the cold floor. The air inside felt different now, less oppressive, as though the silence that had gripped the place for days had finally begun to loosen its hold. The young woman sat where we had left her, wrapped in Holmes's coat, her pale hands trembling against the fabric. She looked up as we entered, eyes wide and haunted, but no longer vacant. Holmes knelt beside her. "He's gone," he said simply. "The man who kept you here will trouble you no more." Her lips parted as though to speak, but at first only a shuddering breath came. Then slowly words formed, fragile, uncertain. He said it was mercy. He said the world had forgotten me, that no one would believe the truth. "And what truth was that?" Holmes asked gently. Her eyes shifted toward the stairway leading to the vault below, as though the memories were still buried there. That I was never Penrith's daughter. I was his clerk's child. My father died when I was small, but Penrith took me in. I was raised in his house, educated under his care. When I grew older, I discovered the nature of his dealings, how his firm used false charities to hide stolen money. I confronted him. He swore he would make amends, but Vale overheard. That night, they quarrelled. I fled to the vicar, begging for help. But Clay betrayed me. Her voice trembled into silence. Holmes leaned forward, his tone quiet but firm. He told you he would keep you safe. She nodded faintly. He said the only way to escape was to disappear, to let them believe I was dead. He gave me something to make me sleep. When I awoke, I was in the coffin. I tried to cry out, but the air was thick. I could not move. Then there was light. He dug me up himself, carried me below, and said no one must ever know I still lived. The horror of it struck me speechless. Even Holmes's impassive face hardened for an instant before he composed himself again. "And you remained here willingly?" he asked softly. "I was too weak to flee, and he was kind at first. He brought food, books, spoke of redemption. But when I asked to leave, he changed. He said the silence must continue, that the sins of the living would consume the innocent if I spoke." Her gaze fell to the floor. I stopped counting the days after the bells ceased to ring. Holmes rose, his expression grave. "Watson, fetch the inspector at once. The Yard must take her statement while her recollection is fresh, and see that a carriage is brought from the inn. She cannot remain here another hour." As I left to do his bidding, the churchyard was already stirring with villagers, drawn by the commotion of the night. Word of Vale's arrest had spread quickly, and whispers followed in my wake, rumours of graves disturbed and ghosts unearthed. When I returned with Lestrade and the carriage, Holmes was still at her side, dictating notes in his precise, deliberate manner, while the girl answered with calm that seemed unnatural after such an ordeal. Lestrade listened to her story in silence, his usual bluster subdued by awe. "We'll see, she's taken somewhere safe," he said when she had finished. "Vale's confession will match it well enough, and the papers in the vault will finish the rest." Holmes gave a short nod. "You will find among them proof of Clay's collusion and evidence that Vale's fortune was built on fraudulent export bonds. The Yard will have its triumph, but the true victory lies in restoring this woman's name." He turned to her with unexpected gentleness. "You have suffered more than any soul should, but the law will not fail you now. The storm is over." She looked at him with a faint, incredulous smile. "You do not understand, Mr. Holmes. Storms do not end. They only move elsewhere." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, and I could see that her words had touched him more deeply than he would admit. He offered his hand to help her into the carriage, and as the horses began their slow departure across the snow, he stood watching until it vanished down the lane. When at last we turned toward Baker Street that afternoon, the sky above London hung low and grey. Holmes sat silent for most of the journey, his eyes half closed, his thoughts, like the smoke from his unlit pipe, coiling inward upon themselves. At length I said, "You look weary, Holmes. The case is solved, and yet you seem dissatisfied." He gave a soft, humourless laugh. "Solved, yes, but only upon the surface. There is no triumph in exposing corruption that merely changes its name. Vale is taken, Penrith is dead, Clay is gone beneath the ice, yet their design remains, a system built on quiet complicity. It is not one crime we have ended, but only one expression of it." I could find no answer to that, and we rode the rest of the way in silence. The city received us with its usual indifference, fog curling along the eaves, carriages rattling through slush, the faint clang of distant bells breaking through the din. When we reached Baker Street, Holmes went directly to his chair by the fire. He lit his pipe, drew deeply and stared into the coals with that peculiar absorption which always signalled the turning of his mind from action to reflection. I poured 2 cups of tea and set one beside him. After a long pause he said, "You observed, no doubt, that Clay's final words were not a plea but an instruction. Guard her. That, Watson, was not sentiment, it was forewarning. There are names in those ledgers the Yard has not yet uncovered, men of influence who will not relish their exposure. Our task, therefore, is not entirely concluded." I looked up sharply. "You mean to pursue it further?" He smiled faintly. "When has a pursuit ever ended with the truth half buried?" "No, Watson. There are still bells to be rung for the living before the dead can rest. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of London, another hand is already reaching for the string." Outside, the fog thickened until the street vanished altogether. The fire flickered low, casting restless shadows upon the walls. Holmes leaned back, the gleam of deduction softening into something that might almost have been melancholy. "Strange, is it not," he said softly, "that the loudest crimes are born of silence, a churchyard kept mute, a conscience unspoken, a lie whispered often enough to sound like peace. One might almost envy the dead their stillness." I said nothing. The clock on the mantel struck the hour, each chime a clear note in the hush that followed. And in that fragile silence between the last echo and the turning of the world beyond our window, I felt again the weight of all that had passed, the frozen graves, the whispered vows, and the shadow of a truth that would not stay buried. Holmes drew the curtain aside and gazed into the fog. "The case of the silent funeral, Watson," he murmured, "will not soon leave me. The living have spoken, but the silence, they say, it listens still." He let the curtain fall, and the firelight caught the smoke rising from his pipe, curling upward like a final benediction to the dead. And so ended one of the strangest, most haunting cases ever to touch the keen mind of Sherlock Holmes, a mystery solved not by noise or glory, but by the breaking of a single, terrible silence. Several days passed before the world settled into its usual rhythm again. The newspapers devoted half a column to the Northumberland Heath affair, praising the vigilance of Scotland Yard and making perfunctory mention of Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. Lestrade, beaming with unearned glory, came one afternoon to deliver his official thanks along with a packet of documents unearthed from the church vault. Holmes received them with a nod and returned to his violin without comment. It was only when the inspector had gone that he spoke. "The Yard has done its duty," he said quietly, turning the pages with delicate precision. "But, as usual, it has misunderstood the essence of the thing. They see only crime and consequence, never the invisible chain that binds both together." He laid the papers aside and reached for the Morning Post. Among the envelopes lay one without a seal, addressed in a delicate, feminine hand. He opened it, and as he read, I saw the faintest softening of his features. "She writes from Dover," he said. "Our young lady, now Miss Edith Gray, I believe. The authorities have placed her under the protection of an old friend of mine from the Coast Guard. She intends to begin again abroad, away from the shadow of London. A wise choice." He folded the letter and slipped it into his breast pocket with unusual care. "Her survival, Watson, was not chance. It was the triumph of endurance over terror, a virtue as rare as genius." I watched him for a moment. "And yet," I said, "I cannot shake the feeling that this case has troubled you more deeply than most. You are not given to melancholy, Holmes, but since that night, since the bells were unmuffled, you have been curiously still. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "Because, my dear fellow, this case revealed something I have long suspected, that the line between protector and oppressor is perilously thin. Reverend Clay believed he was preserving purity by concealing guilt. Vale thought he was saving reputation through deceit. Even Penrith convinced himself that silence was mercy. Each man justified his sin by calling it duty." He turned toward the fire, the flicker of its glow tracing the sharp lines of his face. "You see, Watson, the world is full of those who prefer quiet lies to noisy truths. It is the detective's curse to disturb such peace, but I confess there are moments, rare and fleeting, when I envy them their silence." I could find no reply, and the ticking of the mantel clock filled the pause between us. Then Holmes rose suddenly as though shaking off an invisible weight. "Still we have work ahead. The ledgers from Penrith's vault contain names yet unspoken, politicians, financiers, even a judge. The echoes of this affair will reach further than the grave. If the dead have been avenged, the living must now be unmasked." He crossed to the window, brushing the curtain aside. The fog had lifted over Baker Street, and the winter sunlight glinted faintly upon the snow. London, vast and indifferent, stirred beneath it, the same city of ambition and ruin that had birthed 1,000 such secrets. Holmes smiled faintly, a trace of the old energy returning to his eyes. "Do you recall, Watson, what the Reverend said in his last breath? Guard her. At the time, I believed it a plea for mercy. Now I see it was a warning. Silence, once broken, tends to speak louder than any confession. Somewhere the remaining conspirators will hear her voice, and when they do, they will act. I shall be ready." "You expect retribution?" I asked. "I expect consequence," he replied simply. "Truth seldom walks alone." He turned then, his gaze meeting mine with that familiar blend of challenge and camaraderie that had marked 100 adventures. "Come, Watson, there is correspondence to draft and inquiries to make. The game, though quieter than most, is still afoot." And so the days resumed their pattern, the crackle of the fire, the hum of London through the window, the rustle of the morning papers. Yet in the quiet moments between our cases, I would sometimes hear the faint echo of church bells, clear, mournful, and hauntingly distant. They seemed to toll, not for the dead of Northumberland Heath, but for all the souls trapped by secrecy, by fear, by their own unwillingness to speak. Holmes heard them too, I think, though he never said as much. Once, when the sound drifted faintly across the city on a cold wind, he lowered his violin and listened for a long while. "Strange, is it not," he murmured, "how silence can leave such a lasting sound?" He set the instrument aside, his eyes distant but alight. "Come, Watson, there will always be another case, another riddle of the human heart to decipher, but tonight let us grant the world a little peace. We have earned it." And as the fire dimmed and the city fell once more into its restless slumber, I felt that peculiar mixture of relief and melancholy that always followed our greatest triumphs. The mystery of the silent funeral had ended, yet its echo lingered, like the toll of unseen bells fading slowly into the fog of London, where even silence, in the end, finds its voice,